31 farm families sat behind Eli Varden when the federal judge asked him to stand. Some held photographs of houses that no longer existed. Others carried deeds, tax receipts, and maps of fields their grandparents had cleared by hand. One woman held soil from a family cemetery she could no longer reach because the road had been fenced off by a development company. By then, the newspapers had given Eli many names: thief, fraudster, land predator, the auctioneer who erased a county. The judge sentenced him to 34 years in federal prison. But the sentence did not restore the farms. It did not reopen the cooperative that had served Calder County. It did not rebuild homes demolished before the lawsuits were finished, and it could not return access to family graves now surrounded by warehouses and security gates. Eli had not destroyed the county with a weapon. He had done it with deadlines, bidder lists, tax notices, and the authority to decide whose payment counted. That was what made the story so difficult to accept. Because long before Eli learned how to take land from others, he had been a 13-year-old boy standing at the back of another auction room, watching strangers purchase his childhood. His father was in a hospital bed. His mother arrived carrying a glass jar filled with bills and coins saved from groceries. It was not enough. When the family farm was sold, Eli watched men laugh near the doorway while his mother tried not to cry. The auctioneer looked at the jar and said that memories could not pay taxes. Eli never forgot those words. For years, he told himself that everything he did afterward began in that room. He believed hard work meant nothing without power, and that the only way to remain safe was to become the person standing above everyone else. But pain was not the only thing that shaped him. He was offered honesty. He was given a profession. He was trusted by a mentor, loved by a wife, and warned by people who understood where his anger was leading. More than once, Eli knew the difference between protecting the powerless and using them. More than once, he chose power. So how did a boy who watched his family lose 60 acres become the man who drove 31 families from theirs? The answer began with humiliation, but it ended with choices. The federal courtroom in Little Rock was quiet in the way rooms become quiet when too many lives have already been spoken for. Eli Varden stood beside his attorneys. Behind him sat farmers, widows, mechanics, and families whose names had appeared on Calder County land records for generations. They had come because it was the only place left where anyone in authority was required to listen. Naomi Reed sat in the first row. Her family had owned 47 acres outside Street Mercy since before the Second World War. The land had given them soybeans, a small house, and a road leading to the cemetery where Naomi's father and brothers were buried. After the sale, the house was demolished. The road was blocked. Jonas Pike sat farther back. He had lost the repair shop where he serviced tractors for half the county. Years earlier, Jonas had been the first person to benefit when Eli quietly bent a rule. He later became one of the people destroyed when Eli stopped believing old loyalties mattered. Ruth Reed held a photograph of the cemetery gate. They did not look like the enemies Eli had described in private. They looked tired. The prosecutor, Daniel Cross, told the judge that the case could not be measured only in dollars. 31 families had lost land or homes. A farming cooperative had closed. Workers had moved away. Some properties had been returned on paper, but houses were gone, and fields lay beneath concrete. These were not accidental errors, Cross said. They were decisions made by a man who understood exactly what a tax sale could take from a family. Eli lifted his head. He knew what a tax sale could take. That was the foundation of his defense and the deepest proof against him. His attorneys described his childhood poverty, his father's illness, and the sale of the Varden farm. They spoke of a boy who learned that a stamped notice could remove a family from the only place it had called home. All of that was true. But the truth of Eli's childhood did not erase Naomi's empty field. It did not restore Jonas's shop. It did not reopen the cemetery road for Ruth. When the judge asked whether Eli wished to speak, he rose slowly. For one moment, it seemed he might turn toward the families. He did not. He said Delta Meridian Development had manipulated him. He said the county's financial system had been broken long before he entered it. Each statement contained enough truth to sound reasonable. That had always been one of Eli's gifts. He rarely built a lie from nothing. He took a real wound or injustice and placed it around the choice he did not want to admit was his. Grant Sutter had used him. The tax system often punished people with the fewest resources, but Grant had not forced Eli to reject Naomi's receipts. No executive had made him silence Hazel Boone. No broken institution required him to continue after he recovered the Varden property. The judge sentenced Eli to 34 years in federal prison. The old Varden farm would be sold again, this time to help compensate the families he had harmed. Only then did Eli look back. Not at Naomi. Not at Ruth. Not even at Lorna, who sat near the aisle and had not spoken to him in nearly 2 years. He looked at the evidence table. Inside a clear box sat a small glass jar. Its metal lid was rusted. A few coins remained at the bottom. Investigators had found it in the kitchen cabinet of the abandoned Varden farmhouse after Eli secretly acquired the property. His mother, May, had once carried that jar into the Calder County auction room, filled with grocery money, folded bills, and everything she believed might keep her family from being removed. At 13, Eli had watched strangers glance at the jar and then look away. He remembered his mother's hands around the glass. He remembered believing every person in that room had chosen not to care. What he did not understand was that the story he carried from that day was incomplete. His father had hidden debts. Help had been offered. Pride had closed doors before the auctioneer opened the bidding. And among the adults in that room was Hazel Boone, a woman who had tried to delay the sale and would later give Eli the first honest path back into the world. To understand why he betrayed her, the story must return to the day the jar was still full, the farm still carried the Varden name, and Eli was only a boy learning the wrong lesson from the worst day of his life. Calder County, Arkansas, was the kind of place where land carried more than value. It carried names. A field was where someone's grandfather had cleared brush, where a wedding photograph had been taken beside a fence post, and where children learned which road flooded first in spring. The Varden farm sat 3 miles outside Street Mercy, beyond a drainage canal and a row of pecan trees. It was not large. 60 acres looked generous to a child. But to Abel Varden it was barely enough to survive. Every season began with borrowed money. Seed was bought on credit. Fuel was delayed until the grain elevator paid. A tractor repair could erase the margin from an entire week. When rain came at the wrong time, Abel became quiet. When prices fell, he became angry at people who were not in the room. Eli did not understand the numbers. He understood the weather of his father's face. At 10, he knew not to ask for school shoes during harvest. At 12, he had learned that adults used the phrase, "we'll be all right," most often when they were not. May Varden managed the household with envelopes, jars, and small acts of denial. She reused aluminum foil, kept receipts in a tobacco tin, and placed grocery money in a glass jar above the refrigerator. Eli sometimes watched her count it late at night. The coins made a soft sound against the glass. To him, it sounded like protection being built one piece at a time. Abel had inherited the land from his father and believed a Varden man should never need an outsider to explain how to keep what was his. That pride had once made him dependable. As the farm weakened, it made him dangerous to trust. He borrowed against equipment without telling May. Then he borrowed against expected crops. When those crops brought too little, he moved one debt behind another and treated every deadline as something that could be defeated by refusing to speak its name. The county tax notice arrived during a week of heavy rain. May read it twice at the kitchen table. Abel took it from her hand and said he had handled the matter. He had not. 2 weeks later, he collapsed beside the machine shed after complaining of pressure in his chest. The hospital in Pine Bluff kept him for observation. May drove there each morning and returned before dark. She told Eli his father would recover. She did not tell him the farm was days from being listed for sale. The final notice came in a white envelope stamped with the county seal. May opened it at the sink. Eli saw the paper shaking before he saw her hands. The next morning, she removed the grocery jar from above the refrigerator and added money hidden in her sewing basket. She took Eli to the courthouse because no one else was available to watch him. The auction room was smaller than he expected. There were folding chairs, a long table, and men in work shirts discussing parcels they had never walked. A ceiling fan moved warm air without cooling it. Someone near the doorway joked about drainage rights. Eli stood behind his mother and looked for a person prepared to stop what was happening. No one did. May showed the notice to a clerk and explained that Abel was in the hospital. She asked whether the amount could be paid in installments. The clerk was polite, tired, and certain. The deadline had passed. The money in the jar was not enough. Hazel Boone, then a junior auction coordinator, overheard them. She checked whether a short postponement was possible and returned with a restructuring form that Abel could sign from the hospital. May called him. Eli could not hear every word, but he heard his father's anger through the receiver. Abel said no one would place Varden land under supervision. He would not sign away control of property his family had worked for generations. May begged him to reconsider. Abel refused. Years later, Eli would remember May crying without sound, the clerk checking the clock, and Hazel holding the unsigned form. He would not remember his father's choice with the same clarity. When the Varden parcel was announced, May stepped forward with the jar in both hands. She asked whether the money could at least be counted toward the balance. The auctioneer said memories could not pay taxes. Perhaps he meant only that the rules could not change because a family was grieving. To Eli, the sentence became a law of the world. He watched the property sell to a buyer from outside the county. The price was higher than the tax debt and lower than what the farm meant to anyone who had lived there. By the end of the week, the Vardens were packing. Ruth Reed arrived with boxes and food. Her husband offered a trailer they could rent near the highway. Other neighbors brought blankets and canned goods. Eli thanked no one. He watched each act of kindness as proof that everyone could see how far the Vardens had fallen. The trailer smelled of old carpet and propane. Trucks passed through the night. From his bedroom, Eli could see the gas station sign but no fields, pecan trees, or fence carrying his family's name. He began collecting documents. He saved envelopes, receipts, bank notices, and forms May planned to discard. He wrote dates in a school notebook. He learned the meanings of delinquent, assessed value, lien, and redemption period before he learned to drive. Paper had taken the farm. Eli decided he would learn the language of paper better than anyone who might ever use it against him. At school, when classmates asked why his family had moved, Eli told them the county had stolen the land while his father was sick. It was not entirely false. That made it easier to repeat. Each time he told the story, Abel's hidden debts disappeared. His refusal to sign Hazel's form disappeared. The auction room became a place filled only with cruel adults laughing at a sick farmer's family. The story protected Eli from shame. It also taught him that facts could be arranged around pain until pain became innocence. Ruth continued bringing May groceries and offered Eli rides when the truck failed. He accepted because he had to, but remembered every favor as a debt he had never agreed to owe. May tried once to explain that losing the farm had not been caused by one person. Eli told her she was defending the people who had taken their home. May did not argue. Her silence felt like surrender. By 14, Eli no longer believed safety came from family, neighbors, or fairness. He believed it came from understanding the rules before anyone else did. That belief was not yet criminal. For a frightened boy, it was almost reasonable. But survival lessons can change when carried too long. The need to understand rules became a need to control them. The fear of owing kindness became contempt for anyone who offered it. And the story Eli told to protect his father slowly became the story he would use to excuse himself. The first wound did not make Eli Varden a criminal. It gave him a map. Years later, when he finally stood at the front of an auction room, he would still be following it. The Vardens did not lose their family on the day they lost the farm. That happened more slowly. Abel came home from the hospital with medication in a paper bag and instructions to rest. For the first few days, he behaved as if nothing essential had changed. He sharpened tools he no longer owned. He asked May whether the south field had drained after the rain, then stopped when he remembered the field belonged to someone else. The trailer became too small for his anger. He criticized the walls, the neighbors, the traffic, and the landlord's rules. Some nights, he sat outside until morning with a bottle near his chair. Other nights, he told Eli that a man who allowed people to see weakness would spend the rest of his life being managed by them. Eli listened. At 13, he could not separate his father's pain from his father's authority. If Abel sounded certain, Eli believed certainty must be strength. May saw something different. Bills continued arriving for equipment the family no longer possessed. A lender called about a note she had never signed. Then she found loan agreements hidden inside an old feed catalog Abel had brought from the farm. The papers showed that the trouble had begun years before his hospital stay. Abel had borrowed against 2 harvests that failed to produce what he promised. He had used machinery as security, then listed the same equipment while negotiating another loan. He had believed one good season would repair every decision made in the bad ones. When May confronted him, Eli heard the argument through the thin bedroom wall. "You told me the taxes were handled," she said. "I was handling them. You were moving numbers from one page to another. I was keeping this family alive." May's voice became quieter. That frightened Eli more than shouting. Keeping us alive would have meant telling me. Abel accused her of taking the county's side. He said Hazel Boone's restructuring proposal would have placed the land under someone else's control and reduced him to a hired hand on his own property. May answered that a temporary loss of control would have been better than losing everything. Eli heard the words but rejected their meaning. To accept May's version, he would have needed to see Abel as a man whose pride had helped destroy the home he claimed to protect. That idea was more painful than believing the county had acted with simple cruelty. So Eli made a choice. He decided his mother had become weak. It was unfair, and somewhere inside him he knew it. May had worked longer hours, counted every dollar, and faced the courthouse, while Abel refused to sign the only form that might have bought them time. But Eli was not ready for a truth that made courage look like May and fear look like Abel. Within months, Abel left. He told Eli he was going south to find work. He returned 6 weeks later with little money and a story about an employer who had cheated him. May allowed him back because winter was coming and because despair can make people accept the return of what already hurt them. The pattern repeated. Abel found temporary work, lost it after an argument, came home angry, and promised the next opportunity would be different. Each failure became evidence that other people had conspired against him. Eli began working after school. He cleaned equipment sheds and carried irrigation pipe on farms that stretched across land his family had once considered equal to its own. Some owners treated him well. That almost made the work worse. Kindness from people who still possessed land felt like proof that they could afford to be generous. One afternoon, Jonas Pike offered Eli half his lunch and said nobody at school blamed him for what happened. Eli heard pity where Jonas meant friendship. "I don't need anybody feeling sorry for me," he said. Jonas did not offer again. This was how Eli began turning away people who had not harmed him. He protected himself from humiliation by treating every open hand as if it concealed a debt. May tried to persuade him to apply for a vocational program in Little Rock. She said Calder County did not have to become the border of his life. Eli refused. Leaving would mean allowing strangers to keep the land while the Vardens disappeared. He had no plan to recover it, but he had already decided that departure would look too much like surrender. Abel died when Eli was 19. The official cause was heart failure. By then, his body had been weakened by work, alcohol, poor food, and years of refusing medical advice. At the funeral, neighbors spoke about the Abel they remembered before the deaths. The man who repaired fences during storms and pulled a family from a flooded truck. Eli held tightly to those stories. May said very little. Afterward, she gave Eli a wooden file box Abel had kept in storage. "Your father loved that farm," she said. "But loving something does not mean every choice you make for it is right." Inside were bank letters, loan papers, notices, and a folded copy of the restructuring proposal Hazel had tried to deliver. Eli read only the first page. It confirmed that assistance had been offered before the sale. It also showed Abel had refused the terms. Eli folded the paper again. For several minutes, he sat alone with the box open. He understood enough to know the story he had repeated for 6 years was incomplete. He could have read everything. He could have asked May what happened. He could have allowed anger to become grief instead of identity. Instead, he closed the lid. Eli told himself a dead man deserved protection from documents he could no longer explain. He said the details no longer mattered because the outcome had been unjust, but the details mattered to him. That was why he refused to face them. His decision did not change what Abel had done. It changed what Eli allowed himself to learn from it. He preserved his father as a pure victim, and May as someone who had failed to defend him. He preserved the county as a single enemy. Most importantly, he preserved himself as the child of an injustice so complete that any future act against the system could be called repayment. The years after Abel's death were not empty. Eli completed a bookkeeping course at the community college. He became skilled at reading property records and tracing deadlines other people missed. He took temporary work in county offices, where supervisors noticed that he rarely made clerical errors. Knowledge calmed him. Every form understood was one less way the world could surprise him. Then, Hazel Boone saw his name on an application for a records position connected to county auctions. She remembered the boy standing behind May Varden. She also remembered the unsigned restructuring form in her hand. Hazel could have avoided him. Instead, she offered Eli an entry-level job in her office. It was the first time someone connected to the worst day of his life placed trust in him without asking him to deny what had happened. For a while, that trust would give Eli another way to live. But first, he would have to decide whether learning the truth mattered more than protecting the anger that had carried him this far. Hazel Boone's office occupied 2 rooms above the county records department. The first held filing cabinets, parcel maps, and a counter where frightened people arrived carrying envelopes they did not understand. The second contained Hazel's desk, an adding machine, and a window overlooking the courthouse parking lot. Eli began by sorting notices. He expected Hazel to treat him like someone being rescued. She did not. She corrected his mistakes, gave him unpleasant jobs, and required him to explain every rule in plain language before speaking with a property owner. "A person should not lose land because we enjoy sounding important," she told him. Hazel believed rules mattered enough to be understood by the people most likely to be harmed by them. Under her supervision, Eli learned how many families came close to losing property because of failures that were not always their own. A notice went to an old address. A widow misunderstood a deadline. A bank processed a payment late. A farmer recovering from surgery left an envelope unopened. Hazel never promised outcomes she could not deliver. But when the law allowed time, correction, or review, she made sure people received it. Eli was good at the work. He could find a missing reference number in a stack of forms and remember which parcel had changed hands 20 years earlier. More importantly, he understood the fear on the other side of the counter. The first family he helped was an elderly widow named Clara Benton. Her notice had been mailed to the nursing facility where her husband died, then returned without reaching her. By the time Clara appeared, her small pecan property was scheduled for sale. Eli found the returned envelope and a note showing the county already had her correct address. Hazel used the error to request a postponement. Clara kept the land. A week later, she brought Eli pecan preserves and cried while thanking him. He did not feel pity. He felt useful. For a brief time, this was what power meant to him. Seeing danger before someone else did and moving it away. Hazel noticed. "You could be very good at this," she said. "But being good is not the same as being trusted. Trust is what you do when the person across the counter will never know what choice you made for them." Eli remembered the words. He did not yet understand how soon he would violate them. Jonas Pike returned during Eli's second year in the office. Jonas had inherited a repair yard from an uncle. The business survived on seasonal work and cash payments from farmers who delayed repairs until machinery stopped. A nearby parcel containing an old workshop was expected to enter a county sale. If Jonas acquired it cheaply, he could expand and avoid closing. He asked Eli whether the parcel was likely to attract outside bidders. Eli said he could not discuss unpublished information. Jonas nodded and prepared to leave. Then he said, "I'm not asking you to steal anything. I just need one chance before somebody from Memphis buys it without knowing where Street Mercy is." The request touched several wounds. Eli remembered men discussing the Varden farm, as if no family lived there. He remembered Jonas offering half a lunch after the auction and the anger with which he had rejected it. Helping him now felt like correcting an old insult. Eli told Jonas when the parcel would appear and mentioned that a larger adjoining property was likely to draw most outside interest. It was not much information. That was how he described it to himself. Jonas prepared early, faced little competition, and secured the workshop. He later hired 2 local mechanics and began taking more repair work. The outcome looked good. No widow lost a home. A local business grew. And Jonas treated Eli as the reason. At dinner, Jonas raised a glass to the man who had finally learned how to make the county work for people like them. Eli felt admired. The problem surfaced in the bid records. An outside buyer complained that Jonas appeared to know the timing and grouping of parcels before the public notice was complete. Hazel reviewed the sequence and asked Eli whether he had spoken to anyone. She closed the office door and said that if he had made an error, this was the moment to report it. The county could document the disclosure, review the sale, and place him under supervision. He might temporarily lose auction duties, but not necessarily his job. Eli understood what she was offering. It was a way back. He also understood Hazel would see him differently. The young man she trusted with frightened families would become the boy she had saved from his own poor judgment. "No," he said. "I didn't tell anyone." Hazel held his gaze long enough for him to feel the lie between them. A junior clerk named Peter Sloan had printed several preliminary notices. Because Peter sometimes met Jonas at the same diner, suspicion shifted toward him. Eli could have stopped it. Instead, he said Peter had left documents unattended more than once. That statement was true. It was also irrelevant, and Eli knew why he was saying it. Peter received a warning and was removed from auction preparation for 3 months. He did not lose his job. Eli used that fact to calm himself. Jonas kept the workshop. 2 mechanics remained employed. Eli arranged the consequences like figures in a ledger and decided the total was positive. But Hazel changed. She still trained him, yet the warmth in her confidence disappeared. She required second signatures on some files and stopped discussing retirement plans in front of him. Eli felt guilty when Peter avoided him in the hallway. He nearly confessed twice. Each time, he imagined Hazel's disappointment and told himself that admitting the truth would damage more lives than preserving the lie. This was the first time Eli knowingly protected his position by allowing an innocent person to carry suspicion. It was also the first time dishonesty rewarded him. Nothing collapsed. That apparent absence of disaster taught Eli the wrong lesson. He began to believe fairness was not a rule. It was a result he was qualified to define. Hazel had taught him how to find mercy inside procedure. Eli had discovered something more intoxicating. He could decide who deserved it. For several years, Eli Varden came close to becoming the man Hazel Boone believed he could be. He worked longer hours than anyone in the county office. He corrected address errors before notices were mailed, called elderly property owners when forms looked incomplete, and developed a reputation for explaining tax procedures without humiliating the people standing in front of him. Peter Sloan eventually returned to auction work. He and Eli remained polite but never close. Hazel continued requiring additional review on Eli's files, yet she did not dismiss him. Eli interpreted her decision as proof that the past had been settled. It had not. Hazel had chosen patience. Eli had chosen silence. During this period, he met Lorna Bell at the Calder County Library. She was organizing old property maps for a local history display and asked Eli why several roads carried names that no longer appeared on modern records. He answered for nearly an hour. Lorna was not impressed by authority, but she admired competence. She liked that Eli knew where forgotten boundaries ran and which families had once lived beyond them. Eli liked that she listened without pity when he spoke about the Varden farm. They married 2 years later. Their first home was a small rental with a leaking back window and a yard barely large enough for tomatoes. Lorna treated it as if permanence could be created through care. She painted the kitchen, repaired curtains from the library's donation bin, and planted rosemary near the steps. Eli loved her, but he never called the house theirs. When Lorna suggested they save for a modest property closer to town, Eli said buying someone else's land would only prove that the Varden land was gone. Lorna did not argue. She believed grief sometimes needed time before it could become something gentler. At work, Eli's position improved. Hazel allowed him to lead meetings with property owners and trusted him to prepare postponement requests. He helped an elderly couple correct a classification error that would have doubled their tax burden. The husband shook Eli's hand and said Calder County needed more men like him. Praise settled differently inside Eli than gratitude had. Gratitude made him feel useful. Praise made him feel important. Small gifts began appearing. A basket of vegetables, a discounted repair, tickets to a high school football game. Most were harmless and openly offered. Hazel required employees to report anything of value, but Eli stopped recording the smaller favors. He told himself no person could purchase his judgment with tomatoes or free labor. What he did not admit was that each favor created a quiet network of people who saw him as someone above ordinary procedure. Then May became ill. By the time doctors diagnosed the cancer, it had already spread. Eli visited her trailer after work and repaired things that no longer mattered. A loose cabinet hinge, a porch light, a dripping faucet. May watched him move through the rooms and understood that he preferred labor to conversation. One evening, she asked whether he had read the rest of Abel's papers. Eli said there was nothing in the box worth reading. May looked toward the window. "Your father was not a bad man," she said. "But pain made him protect his pride more than he protected us." Eli heard criticism where she meant warning. He told her she had forgiven the county because forgiveness was easier than fighting. May did not defend herself. "You have spent your whole life fighting people who are no longer in the room," she said. It was the last serious conversation they had. May died 3 months later. Among the few possessions she left Eli were the glass savings jar, Abel's file box, and a short note asking him not to let the farm decide the value of every good thing that came afterward. Eli read the note twice. Then he placed it inside the box without opening the other documents. Lorna found him sitting on the floor beside it. She did not ask him to explain. She sat with him until morning. That was another door back. Eli had a wife who did not require him to be powerful, a home that could have become permanent, and work through which he could prevent the kind of loss that had shaped him. Hazel was preparing to retire. She told Eli that, with several more years of clean service, she would recommend him to lead county auction administration. The phrase clean service stayed with him. He wondered whether Hazel still suspected what had happened with Jonas. Instead of taking the opportunity to confess, he became more careful about being questioned. At the same time, he began quietly tracking the Varden property. It had passed through 2 owners and was now held by an agricultural investment company. The farmhouse stood mostly empty. Several fields were leased to growers who had no connection to Calder County. Eli drove past it after work. Sometimes he stopped beyond the pecan trees and watched lights from distant machinery cross the land. Lorna knew where he went, but said nothing until he returned late on their anniversary. "You are still living in that house," she told him, "and it has been empty for years." Eli said she could not understand. Lorna answered that she understood enough to know the farm had become a place where he stored every grievance he did not want to release. She offered a different future. They could buy a small home, leave Calder County if necessary, and build a life not measured against what Abel had lost. Eli wanted to accept. For a few days, he searched property listings with her. They discussed mortgages, neighborhoods, and whether they needed an extra room. Then a local land broker mentioned that the Varden parcel might eventually be broken into smaller lots. The thought of strangers dividing it awakened the old panic. Eli stopped looking at houses with Lorna. He told himself they should wait until they had more money. What he meant was that no other property would count. The life in front of him was real. It was decent. It had been built through work, trust, and the patience of people who continued loving him after he made himself difficult to reach. But Eli did not see that life as recovery. He saw it as preparation. He still believed the true measure of whether he had escaped the auction room was whether he could one day reverse its result. And because the wrong thing had not yet cost him enough, he continued accepting small favors, preserving old lies, and waiting for the power that would finally allow him to take the land back. Hazel Boone announced her retirement at the beginning of planting season. The county office held a small luncheon in the records room. There was sheet cake, weak coffee, and a framed certificate thanking her for 32 years of service. Eli stood beside her, while coworkers spoke about the families she had helped and the disputes she had settled without making anyone feel small. Hazel smiled through most of it. When the room emptied, she asked Eli to stay. On her desk sat an old folder tied with cotton string. The paper had yellowed around the edges. Eli recognized the Varden parcel number before she turned it toward him. He did not touch it. Hazel said she had kept copies because the sale had troubled her for years. At the time, she had been too junior to stop the process. But she had tried to secure a postponement and a debt restructuring review. Eli said he already knew that. "You know the version you allowed yourself to know," she answered. Inside the folder were letters Abel had received months before the hospital stay. They showed that the tax debt was only one part of a larger collapse. Equipment loans had gone unpaid. Crop income had been pledged more than once. A local bank had offered to separate the family residence from part of the acreage, allowing the Vardens to keep their house while selling fields they could no longer afford. Abel had refused. Another document showed that Hazel arranged for a state agricultural advisor to meet him. Abel never appeared. The final page was a handwritten note from May. She had asked Hazel whether anything could be done without humiliating her husband. Hazel had written back that assistance required Abel to disclose the full debt and accept temporary financial oversight. He chose neither. Eli read each page. For years, he had treated the sale as a single act committed against his family. The folder showed something harder to carry. The county had been rigid. The auctioneer had been cruel. The system had given a struggling family too little compassion and too little time. But Abel had also been warned. He had been offered paths that might have saved the house. Pride had made those paths feel worse to him than danger. Hazel did not ask Eli to forgive the system. She asked him to tell the truth about it. "Your father was frightened," she said. "He mistook control for dignity. Do not spend your life making the same mistake." The words reached the place in Eli that still belonged to the trailer near the highway. He heard May saying that pain had made Abel protect his pride more than his family. He heard Lorna telling him that the old farmhouse had remained occupied inside him long after it became empty. For several seconds, Eli understood. Then, understanding became unbearable. If Abel had helped cause the loss, Eli's anger no longer had a single clean target. The county had failed them, but so had his father. May had not surrendered. Hazel had not stood by without trying. The story that had guided Eli for most of his life was not entirely false. It was simply arranged to protect him. He pushed the folder across the desk. "You waited until now to show me this. I tried before. You waited until you were leaving. I waited until I believed you were strong enough to read it." Eli stood. He accused Hazel of keeping the documents so she could use them whenever he became inconvenient. He said she had never trusted him and had trained him only to ease her guilt about the Varden sale. Hazel listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "I gave you the truth because I trusted what you might still do with it." Eli left the folder behind. That decision mattered more than his anger. Anger could have passed. The documents would still have been there the next morning. He did not return for them. 3 days later, Grant Sutter introduced himself in the courthouse parking lot. Grant wore polished boots that had never crossed a muddy field and drove a gray sedan with little rock plates. He represented Delta Meridian Development, a company studying Calder County for a regional freight and warehouse project. He spoke first about jobs. The cooperative was weakening. Young people were leaving. Several farms carried tax debt. Grant said the county could either manage the change or watch outside investors manage it. Eli asked why a development company needed him. Grant said Eli understood the land records, the families, and the history behind each parcel. More importantly, people trusted him. The compliment felt different from the praise Eli received at work. Grant did not see him as a helpful clerk. He spoke as if Eli were already a man with influence. Grant never directly asked him to break the law. He described properties likely to become available, investors willing to act quickly, and a future in which Eli could help decide which local businesses survived the transition. He suggested that outdated farms could be converted into something that kept Calder County economically alive. Then he mentioned the Varden property. The investment company holding it was considering a sale. Delta Meridian might acquire it as part of a larger group of parcels. If Eli helped the project move efficiently, Grant believed there could be a way for the farmhouse and several surrounding acres to return to him. Eli felt the old panic change shape. For years, the farm had been in absence. Grant made it sound like a transaction. Eli knew why the offer was dangerous. A county employee could not privately guide a company seeking advantage in tax-related land sales. He knew that Grant had researched his history and chosen the one promise most likely to weaken him. He also knew what Hazel would tell him to do. Report the conversation. Step away from any related files. Preserve the public trust before temptation became conduct. Instead, Eli asked Grant where they could speak without being seen. They met the following week at a diner outside the county line. Grant brought maps, but no written proposal. He described development zones, transportation access, and groups of parcels that would become more valuable if acquired together. Eli did not provide confidential records at that first meeting. He did something more important. He agreed to listen. He told himself that listening was not participation. He said the project might happen without him, and that an outsider would show less concern for local families. If he remained close, perhaps he could protect the right people. But Eli already knew how that argument worked. He had used it when he helped Jonas. He had used it when Peter carried suspicion. He had used it whenever an outcome he wanted required someone else to absorb the risk. This time, the scale was larger. Hazel had offered him the final truth about his past. Grant offered him the power to avoid it. By the end of the meeting, Eli had not taken money or altered a record. He had only made a private decision. He would rather become powerful enough to reverse the auction than accept that no amount of power could make his father's choices disappear. That was the moment his wound stopped being only something that had happened to him. It became something he was willing to use. Hazel retired at the end of summer. Her name remained on the office door for 2 weeks because no one remembered to remove the brass plate. Eli passed it every morning without looking directly at it. The county appointed him acting auction administrator while the board considered a permanent replacement. The decision made sense. Eli knew the files, the land histories, and the families who came through the office. He had spent years becoming the person everyone called when a notice looked wrong. For the first time, no second signature followed his own. The change was subtle. Grant Sutter did not ask Eli to falsify a document or invent a debt. He asked about timing, properties likely to become difficult, and owners who had stopped responding to county mail. Eli answered, in general terms. Then general terms became names. He told himself the properties were already in danger. Delta Meridian had not created the debts. The company merely stood ready to purchase land other investors would take anyway. The first parcels were abandoned acreage held by heirs living outside Arkansas. No family was removed. Delta Meridian bought through local companies whose names did not immediately connect to Grant. Then Grant sent Eli a check described as consulting income for regional land analysis. Eli did not deposit it for 3 days. When he finally did, he told himself he had provided knowledge accumulated outside working hours. The amount was modest compared with the value of the land. It did not feel like the price of a crime. It felt like recognition. From there, the boundaries moved. A notice that might once have received another review was allowed to stand. A local bidder's objection was dismissed without the conversation Hazel would have required. A parcel was grouped with adjoining land in a way that made it harder for a small buyer to compete. Eli never thought of a single decision as the moment everything changed. Each choice looked administrative. Together, they began shaping who could remain in Calder County. At public meetings, Eli spoke about efficiency. He said the county had to modernize. He warned that unpaid taxes weakened schools, roads, and emergency services. Most of what he said was true. People trusted him because he understood their fear. He had once stood where they stood. Now he used that understanding to anticipate which arguments would silence them. Behind the auction block, Eli discovered a sensation he had never felt as a boy. Stillness. A room full of anxious people waited for him to speak. Their plans paused when he lifted a hand. Their objections became orderly when he called a name. Nobody laughed at his family. Nobody looked past him. Control did not erase the old humiliation. It made him briefly unable to feel it. Jonas Pike noticed the pattern before most people did. Farmers talked while waiting at his repair yard, and Jonas heard the same complaints from different roads. Notices arriving late, appeals ending quickly, unfamiliar companies appearing at every sale. One evening, Jonas asked whether Delta Meridian was behind the purchases. Eli said outside investment was not automatically corruption. Jonas reminded him that people once said the same thing about the buyer who took the Varden farm. The comparison angered Eli. He told Jonas that Calder County needed jobs more than sentimental attachment to unproductive land. Jonas stared at him. Years earlier, he had thanked Eli for making the system work for local people. Now Eli sounded like those who had never needed mercy. Jonas did not report him. Not yet. He still carried guilt over the workshop. Silence felt like repayment for the favor that had helped save his business. Grant increased the payments and introduced Eli to lawyers and consultants who spoke of logistics corridors, tax growth, and economic renewal. In their presentations, farms appeared as colored blocks. Family cemeteries were access complications. Homes were structures scheduled for removal. Eli disliked the language. He continued helping them. At home, Lorna noticed that he had begun locking the drawer where he kept bank statements. She also noticed a new watch, a hotel receipt from Little Rock, and that Eli no longer complained about the cost of replacing the truck. When she asked whether the county had raised his salary, he said he had been paid for private records research unrelated to his official duties. Lorna worked in a library. She understood the difference between public information and privileged access. She asked to see the agreement. Eli said Grant had not provided one yet. The lie arrived too quickly. Lorna waited until she found copies of parcel maps in his truck, with handwritten marks that did not belong to any county review. She spread them across the kitchen table. Some marks surrounded abandoned land. Others surrounded occupied farms. One of the names was Reed. Lorna asked whether he was helping a company identify properties before families had exhausted their rights. Eli said she was turning complicated economic work into something ugly because she did not understand it. She asked a simpler question. Are you using your office to help them buy land? Eli could have said yes. He could have told her about Grant, the money, and the promise connected to the Varden property. Lorna was frightened, but she had not yet decided to leave. She said they could return the money, contact an attorney, and report everything before more families were harmed. She was even willing to move. They could leave Calder County, find work elsewhere, and accept whatever professional consequences followed. Eli heard the offer as destruction. Leaving meant giving up the office, the county, and the possibility of recovering the farm. It meant admitting that the life he had built on competence could be dismantled by choices he had made himself. He said Lorna had never understood what it meant to have a family erased from its own land. She answered quietly, I gave you a home. You kept treating it like a waiting room. The sentence hurt because it was true. Eli told her the project would bring jobs, that neglected farms would become useful, and that no one could stop the changes already coming. Lorna said she was not asking him to stop history. She was asking him to stop helping powerful people choose who would pay for it. Eli knew she was right. He also knew Grant had not forced him to accept money, hide meetings, or guide the company toward vulnerable properties. The secrecy belonged to him. Still, he refused. Lorna packed a suitcase that night. Before leaving, she placed May's note on the kitchen table, the warning that the old farm must not become the measure of every good thing that followed. Eli did not call her back. For 2 weeks, the house remained exactly as she left it. Her mug stayed beside the sink. Her gardening gloves remained on the porch. Eli moved through the rooms, refusing to admit that a choice had already become a loss. Then Grant called. Delta Meridian had gained control of the company holding the Varden parcel. If the next group of acquisitions proceeded without delay, Grant said, the farmhouse and several surrounding acres could be transferred into an arrangement Eli would eventually control. The promise no longer sounded distant. It sounded close enough to justify everything. By then, Eli understood the cost. Hazel's trust was gone. Lorna had walked away. Jonas had begun asking questions. Families whose fears Eli once recognized were becoming obstacles on maps. He could still stop. Instead, he returned to the auction room and took his place behind the block. The power he had once wanted, so no one could humiliate him, had become the power to decide whose humiliation counted. Naomi Reed arrived at the county office carrying 3 folders and a bank envelope. She did not come as someone asking for mercy. She came as someone presenting proof. The Reed property had been in her family for 4 generations. 47 acres, a farmhouse, 2 machine sheds, and a narrow road leading to a cemetery shared by several related families. The land was not wealthy, but it was productive, and its taxes had been paid. Naomi placed a stamped receipt on Eli's desk. Then a bank confirmation. Then a copy of the county's own acknowledgement showing the payment had been accepted before the deadline. Yet the property remained scheduled for sale. Eli checked the parcel number himself. The error was real. A payment had been posted under the wrong internal code, then separated from the Reed account during a records transfer. Under ordinary circumstances, the sale should have been stopped immediately. Eli knew the correct procedure. He had once built his reputation by finding exactly this kind of mistake. Naomi watched him read. You see it, she said. Eli did. The problem was no longer the Reed property. Correcting the record would require a formal review. That review could expose the pattern surrounding other parcels connected to Delta Meridian. It could reveal dates, communications, and decisions Eli had spent years arranging so they appeared unrelated. One honest correction might pull the entire structure apart. Naomi seemed to understand more than he said. She told him that her mother, Ruth, had known May Varden. After the Vardens lost their farm, Ruth had brought groceries to the trailer and helped May find cleaning work at a church outside Street Mercy. Eli remembered. He had been too ashamed to thank her. Naomi did not use the history as a threat. She said she was reminding him because she believed May would have wanted him to correct what was wrong. The mention of his mother made the office feel smaller. Eli asked Naomi to leave the folders while he reviewed the matter. She refused. These are copies, she said. The originals are somewhere you cannot reach. That was the first moment Eli understood. She was no longer only a property owner protecting her land. She had begun protecting evidence from him. He could still have chosen the truth. He could have suspended the sale, reported the posting error, contacted an attorney, and told Lorna she had been right. The consequences would have been severe. He might have lost his position and freedom, but fewer families would have lost their homes. Naomi offered him an even narrower path. Stop the Reed sale. Review the other disputed parcels. Help the affected families restore their records. If he did that immediately, she would not contact the press before giving the county a chance to act. It was not forgiveness. It was time. Eli asked why she would trust him. I don't, Naomi said. I'm giving you one chance to become someone your mother could still recognize. Eli felt anger first. Not because Naomi was wrong, but because she had spoken to the part of him he had spent years silencing. He told her the payment confirmation might not satisfy every statutory requirement. He said the county could not halt a scheduled process simply because a resident produced documents at the last moment. Naomi pointed to the county stamp. This is not the last moment. This is your office admitting it received the money. Eli looked away. After she left, he called Grant. Grant did not need an explanation. He said the Reed parcel connected two larger sections needed for access to the freight site. Losing it would weaken the acquisition plan and encourage other owners to challenge their files. Grant reminded Eli that the Varden farmhouse transfer was almost ready. Then he said something Eli already knew. If you reopen one record, you reopen all of them. Eli ended the call without answering. For the rest of the afternoon, he kept Naomi's copies beside his hand. Every time he reached for another file, he saw May's name written in Naomi's notes. Hazel arrived before closing. Naomi had called her. Hazel looked older than when she retired, but her voice had not changed. She did not ask about Grant or the money. She placed the Reed receipt beside Eli's keyboard and asked whether the taxes had been paid. Eli said the issue was complicated. No, Hazel replied. Everything around it is complicated. This is not. She told him that stopping the sale would not erase what he had already done. It would not restore her trust or bring Lorna home, but it could prevent Eli from knowingly placing another family where his own family had once stood. Eli asked whether Hazel believed one corrected file could save him. I am not talking about saving you. The words stripped away his final defense. Hazel was asking him to protect Naomi without receiving absolution, gratitude, or a promise that his own suffering would matter more. That was the choice Eli had never learned to make. He wanted every good act to restore something in him. If honesty could not preserve his career, his land, or his image, he saw little reason to choose it. Hazel waited. Eli signed a decision denying Naomi's emergency objection. He wrote that the documentation had been submitted too late for administrative correction before the scheduled sale. He knew the statement distorted the record. He knew the payment had arrived on time. Hazel read the decision. For years, she had wondered whether the boy she trained could still return to the path she gave him. Now she had her answer. You know exactly what you are doing, she said. Eli did not deny it. Naomi appealed, but the sale proceeded before the dispute was resolved. The Reed property passed into a company linked to Delta Meridian. Ruth lost daily access to the cemetery road. Naomi lost the farmhouse where she had cared for both parents. The damage was not yet irreversible. Courts could still intervene. Records could still be examined. But Eli had crossed a different line. Before Naomi, he had hidden behind scale, procedure, development, and the claim that change was unavoidable. Now he had seen a correct receipt, remembered a family that had helped his mother, and looked into the eyes of someone asking only for what was already hers. He chose to take it anyway. That choice did not make him more powerful. It made the rest easier. The Varden farmhouse returned to Eli on a cold morning in November. There was no ceremony. No county official handed him a key. No neighbor came to witness the moment. A lawyer connected to one of Delta Meridian's holding companies called and told him the transfer documents had been completed. Eli drove there alone. The pecan trees were thinner than he remembered. One side of the porch had collapsed, and weeds pressed against the windows. Inside, the rooms smelled of dust, damp wood, and animals that had entered after people stopped caring. For years, Eli had imagined walking through that door as a kind of correction. He expected the house to recognize him. It did not. The kitchen was smaller than the one in his memory. The wall where May had marked his height was hidden behind peeling paint. Abel's workbench was gone. Eli had brought May's glass savings jar with him in a paper bag. He removed it carefully and placed it inside the cabinet above the sink, almost as if returning it to the room where his mother had once counted every coin. Then he stood back and waited for the house to feel like home again. Nothing returned. His mother did not appear at the table. His father did not come through the back door. The boy who had watched the farm disappear did not feel vindicated. Eli stood in the house. He had spent most of his life trying to recover and understood, for one clear moment, that ownership could not restore belonging. That understanding should have ended the scheme. Instead, it frightened him. If the farm could not repair him, then every sacrifice made to obtain it had no meaning. Hazel's trust, Lorna's marriage, Naomi's home, and the years of secrecy would become losses without a reward large enough to justify them. Eli could have stopped and admitted that no reward existed. He chose a different conclusion. The farmhouse was too small. The recovered acreage was too narrow. The surrounding farms, roads, and tree lines still belonged to other people. He told himself he did not feel safe because Delta Meridian's project remained unfinished. Grant called that afternoon. The company needed the final group of parcels before construction financing could close. Several owners were resisting. One property included access used by the farming cooperative. Another belonged to Jonas Pike, whose repair yard stood in the path of a proposed service road. Grant said delay would threaten the entire project. Eli looked through the farmhouse window at land. He could not see beyond the trees. "Move forward," he said. From that point, he no longer acted to recover something his family had lost. He acted to avoid admitting that recovery had failed. The remaining sales moved quickly. Families who believed appeals were still pending learned that ownership had already changed. Tenants received notices from companies they had never heard of. The farming cooperative lost access to storage and transport routes that had kept small growers alive. Jonas came to the courthouse carrying documents and the same anger Eli had once carried as a boy. He asked why his repair yard was included when he had arranged payment. Eli did not meet his eyes. Jonas reminded him of the workshop years earlier. He said the business existed because Eli had once believed local people deserved a chance against outside money. "That was before I understood what this county needs," Eli replied. Jonas realized then that the old favor no longer protected him. It only tied him to the first lie. He left the office and called Naomi. By then, Naomi had begun connecting families whose cases appeared unrelated. She had the original payment records for the Reed property. Lorna had copies of maps and bank statements. Hazel could testify that Eli knowingly rejected valid proof. Jonas added names, dates, and conversations from the repair yard. The pattern became visible. 31 families had lost land, homes, businesses, or legal access tied to their property. Some had made mistakes, some had fallen behind. Others had paid what they owed, and were still swept into a process designed to favor Delta Meridian's network. The victims were not identical. One couple lost the house where they had cared for a disabled brother. A widow lost the field she leased to support herself. 3 families lost access to the cooperative and could no longer afford to continue farming. Ruth Reed needed permission to visit the road leading toward her husband's grave. The damage spread beyond ownership. When the cooperative closed, seasonal workers left. The repair trade weakened. School enrollment fell. Businesses along the county road lost customers. A community built through relationships began disappearing through paperwork. Construction started before the lawsuits were resolved. Several homes were demolished. Fields were graded. Fences rose around land that still carried family disputes in court records. Eli saw the changes from his truck. He told himself development was now too advanced to stop. In reality, the speed of destruction protected him from having to imagine restoration. Federal investigators arrived after Naomi's attorney delivered the records to the state and then to prosecutors outside Calder County. Grant stopped taking Eli's calls. The executives who had praised his knowledge now described him as a county official who acted beyond anything they had authorized. Their lawyers produced carefully limited contracts and denied knowing how Eli made individual decisions. Eli finally understood his place in their plan. He had never been the man shaping Calder County's future. He had been access. When agents entered the county office, Eli did not resist. He watched them remove computers, files, and boxes containing years of decisions that had once made him feel untouchable. Outside, Naomi, Jonas, and several families stood across the street. Eli looked for Grant among the people who had abandoned him. Instead, he saw those he had abandoned first. The farmhouse was seized before he had spent a single night there. The glass jar became evidence. In the holding cell, Eli thought about returning to the kitchen and finding nothing waiting for him. He understood that the moment he recovered the farm had been his last chance to stop for a reason unrelated to fear of punishment. He had received the thing he claimed to want. Then he had chosen 31 more families to lose theirs. That was why his arrest was not the point of no return. The point had come earlier, inside an empty house, when Eli learned power could not heal him and decided other people would keep paying until it did. By the time Eli Varden's trial began in Little Rock, Calder County had already learned that legal recognition and restoration were not the same thing. The cemetery road near the Reed property reopened under a temporary access order, but the cooperative remained closed. Several houses no longer existed, and fields had been graded into construction sites. A judge could acknowledge the wrong without rebuilding the lives around the land. Naomi Reed testified first among the central victims. She described a man who checked the receipt, saw the county stamp, and knew the payment was valid. "He did not make a mistake with us," she said. "He made a decision." Lorna provided bank statements, maps, and copies of the materials she had found. She did not claim Eli had always been cruel. The years when he helped people proved he understood the human meaning of every file he later allowed Delta Meridian to use. When asked why she left, Lorna said, "I did not leave because of what happened to him as a child. I left because of what he kept choosing after he knew the truth." Hazel Boone explained the postponed sales Eli had once helped secure and the trust she had placed in his judgment. Then she described the Reed receipt and the decision Eli signed while knowing the record was false. Hazel did not call him a monster. She said he had become dangerous because he could still recognize fairness and had learned how to speak around it. Jonas Pike admitted his own silence. He told the jury Eli had once given him an advantage and that gratitude had kept him from reporting early warning signs. His workshop was later taken through the same network. "I thought I owed him my silence," Jonas said. "Other families paid that debt." The defense presented Eli's childhood honestly. His attorneys described the Varden sale, Abel's illness, the trailer near the highway, and the humiliation that followed. A psychologist explained how early loss could create an intense need for control. Federal prosecutor Daniel Cross did not dispute any of it. He argued that understanding Eli's wound made his choices clearer, not less serious. Eli had devoted his career to property rules. He understood what it meant for a family name to disappear from a deed, and for a child to watch adults decide that memory had no legal weight. That knowledge had once made him compassionate. Later, it made him precise. The jury convicted Eli of conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts connected to the abuse of his public office. Grant Sutter was convicted separately. Delta Meridian had exploited Eli's access and obsession, but the company had not signed the Reed denial, rejected Hazel's warning, or ordered the final phase to continue after the Varden farm returned to him. At sentencing, the judge said the court could not punish Eli for being angry, ashamed, or wounded. Those experiences were not crimes, nor could the court punish him for wanting back the land his family had lost. The sentence was for what he did with that desire. The judge listed the exits Eli had refused: Hazel's offer of truth, Lorna's offer to leave, Naomi's valid receipt, and the empty farmhouse that proved the past could not be restored. Each exit had remained open long enough for Eli to recognize it. He closed each one himself. Eli had converted public trust into private control. He had chosen families based on their vulnerability and continued after the purpose he used to justify himself had already been fulfilled. Most importantly, he had acted with knowledge of the harm because he had lived through a version of it himself. The judge imposed 34 years in federal prison. She ordered the forfeiture of Eli's assets, including the recovered Varden property, and directed the available proceeds toward restitution. She acknowledged that compensation would be incomplete. Money could not reconstruct demolished homes, reopen the cooperative, or restore the years families had spent scattered across different counties. Eli was offered the opportunity to speak. He stood, looked toward the victims, and said only that he had spent his life believing the farm was the part of him someone else had stolen. Then he sat down. The courtroom did not treat the statement as redemption. Recognition had come after the damage, after the warnings, and after every safe exit had closed behind choices Eli made himself. The Varden property was later sold. Part of the proceeds funded legal assistance for families challenging disputed transfers. The farmhouse was deemed unsafe and removed, Naomi preserved the glass jar in a local historical exhibit documenting the Calder County land cases. She refused to let it be displayed as a symbol of Eli alone. Beside it were photographs from the 31 families. Ruth Reed standing at the reopened cemetery gate. Jonas in a rented garage, repairing machinery with half the equipment he once owned. A former cooperative worker loading a truck in another state. Children posing in front of houses that existed only in old pictures. Some families recovered money. Some recovered legal title. Very few recovered the lives that had grown around the land. That was the final limit of the sentence. The law could name what Eli had done. It could remove his freedom and take back the property he had obtained through betrayal. It could acknowledge that the victims had been wronged. It could not return Calder County to the moment before Eli decided that his pain gave him the right to distribute pain to others. Eli Varden had once been a frightened boy at the back of an auction room, watching his mother lose the place she loved. Understanding that boy explains where the hunger for control began. It does not forgive the man who fed it with 31 other families.